by NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, that this building came down from normal office fires is absolutely ludicrous. Fires, they're an organic, chaotic process. They move through a building area every 20 minutes or so, burning up the fuel in that area, moving on looking for new fuel sources. So buildings that fall due to fires fall over in large deformations, slow, gradual, painful collapses. But even so, we've never had a high-rise collapse due to fire, ever. This would be like the first one, and these fires were not large. They're small, fairly isolated pockets of fire. So it makes no sense. And by the way, they were out. These fires had burned out about an hour prior to the initiation of collapse, which NIST tells us is on floor 12, around column 79. Those fires where they said a fire was ravaging it was burned out. And according to them, in their NIST Appendix L of the draft report. And then they provide this ludicrous story about how this building collapses due to thermal expansion. Well, these beams are fireproof. They're not going to be expanded. They're tied with shear studs into the composite floor decking above them. So they're not going to be moving independent of that deck. In their computer models, they forced the beams to expand by applying all the heat from the theoretical fire into the beam in just 1.5 seconds, forcing it in their computer model to expand and independent of the concrete floor up above, which is how they got in their computer model these shear studs to brace. So then these beams expand, they push on this girder falls off of its seat in their computer model. But the girder couldn't even have been pushed far enough to fall off of its seat. The whole thing is a complete fabrication. But then they say the interior of this building goes through this chaotic collapse where the whole inside is just caving in on itself without telegraphing to the outside of the building at all. In other words, the videos show a straight down, smooth, symmetrical collapse, not warpage of the perimeter steel frame system. But in their computer model, it's completely warped. They can't even get their computer model with all the fakery they employ to mimic the behavior of the building in any respect. So we want not only an investigation of Building 7, but of NIST themselves. Shyam Sunder and John Gross, the two lead investigators and co-project lead.
I've been told that when you build a building, like I'm not a structural engineer, that when engineers build buildings, actually they build it for them to last 2 hours of fire, not more. And reports have been made that fires last much longer in Building 7. And so that engineer told me, well, you know, we just build buildings for them to last 2 hours.
Yes. Well, there's only so much fuel in a given area to burn. So although buildings are designed to last 2 hours minimum, even in high-rise fires that have lasted on multiple floors over 24 hours that are completely ravaged, like Building Building 5, for instance, which did have huge fires, it didn't collapse at all. No steel frame high-rises ever, and we've had 100 examples of very hot, large, and long-lasting fires in these buildings. So, but even given so, there's nothing to burn in an area more than 20 minutes. And the fire couldn't have lasted that long. I got lost my train of thought. The fires was at 5 o'clock, so that's only about 4 hours. So where does NIST come up with 7 hours of fires? And the photos and videos show very small fires that are isolated from each other as well. And if those fires were the cause of the building, we would expect the building to fall over toward the damaged area, because there was some reports of structural damage, but that's on the south side where some of the beams from the World Trade Center managed to damage the facade of that building. Well, if there was structural damage that they were so concerned about that they kept the firefighters from going up into the building, why didn't the building fall over toward that side? Why did NIST say, no, after all, you know, it's been 7 years now, in the final report they say the building did not succumb to structural damage. That was an insignificant factor because it's on the south side. The initiating event was in the northeast at column 79. They also said that diesel fuel was not a significant factor at all, which prior to that they had told Popular Mechanics, oh yeah, there's a huge gash in the building all the way down the south facade, and diesel fuel from the generators was a significant factor. All of that they couldn't justify, so they had to acknowledge it. And they also acknowledged that the building came down at free fall acceleration after being forced by members of AE911Truth to David Chandler in particular, Stephen Jones, who forced them publicly to acknowledge that this building came down that fast. Now, that's as fast as this pen drops. How does that pen drop that fast? Because it has no resistance. But there's 40,000 tons of structural steel in Building 7, resisting that. In fact, it's 5 times stronger than it needed to be. So how did all of a sudden the building fall as if none of those columns were there whatsoever? They had to have been removed, and removed sequentially in time, with virtually simultaneously on each floor, floor by floor, or at least 8 floors, which is the free fall distance that just drops. So this makes no sense whatsoever. And what do they find in the debris pile of Building 7? Pools of, they call it structural, they call it molten steel, flowing like lava, the first responders said. Well, the problem is that the fires, normal office fires, and even jet fuel, don't get hot enough to burn, to melt steel. Steel doesn't melt until about 2,700 degrees. So these fires only get to half that temperature. So what melted this steel? That FEMA documented in the one piece of steel that they saved, this girder that has what? Intergranular melting, rapid oxidation, sulfidation. Where does the sulfur come from? The sulfur can't have come from the gypsum board, which is designed to protect these steel beams and columns. It never has attacked the steel it's designed to protect before. Where does the molten iron come from that we're told in the FEMA report, Appendix C, invaded the grain boundaries of the steel? Molten iron. So they have no answers for those things. Well, thermite is an answer that makes sense because basically FEMA finds thermite, in fact an enhanced form of thermite, thermate, where sulfur's added to iron oxide aluminum powders to become thermate. It's much more effective at cutting through steel like a hot knife through butter. And all of this evidence adds up in support of the hypothesis of explosive controlled demolition by thermate, actually, in the case of Building 7.
You said FEMA found thermite?
FEMA documented in their Appendix C the melting of these girders and particular hot sulfur corrosion attack. And so there's no explanation for that outside of thermate, which uses sulfur as a liquid protectant, which lowers the melting point of steel. So they have, you know, they do say, well, down in the pile, you know, it can get hotter and hotter and hotter because of the insulating dust that was poured over it. But physicists, chemical engineers say, no, you can't have something getting hotter than the flames that are fueling. And hydrocarbons only burn about 1,500 degrees. So short of a high-tech blast furnace like they use to melt steel, you can't develop these kinds of temperatures.
I have several questions. Regarding the eight floors.
You want shorter answers?
No, I have several questions.
Do you want shorter answers?
No, we're good.
Okay.
You know, you can, go to the point. Like,
Okay.
Regarding the 8 floors that, where a free-fall was observed, would it be possible that if there had been raging fires for hours, the resistance of steel does go down pretty much? Would it be possible that the few seconds of free-fall be accountable to 6 hours of fires on those floors?
Well, what you have is these small isolated pockets of fires that are burning throughout the building, leaving one area to cool, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So as the steel is heated up, probably no more than 300 or 400 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 600 degrees Fahrenheit, 300 or 400 degrees centigrade, the steel can only weaken when it gets to be about 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, 600 degrees centigrade, something plus or minus. And so when the fire moves on, that steel regains its strength. So no, it makes no sense that a building could come across the whole perimeter of the building, collapse at free fall acceleration because of steel that is heated up by fires. An organic process that's moving asymmetrically throughout the building over a number of hours. And it can't possibly, because the rest of the steel is intact, strong, so if you had any kind of a collapse, it would be asymmetric, gradual, the building would tip over.
Okay, so then that doesn't count?
Right.
Yeah, because the steel could have been deformed, and then the structural stability of the building compromised, but then we wouldn't see.
So what we do is we rely on experiments. Fortunately, experiments have been done in detail in Cardington. There's tests. They built a 4-story or so steel frame structure. They put 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit of heat under a massive, on the whole building. They created this amazing fire. Some of those beams weren't even fireproof. Did it collapse? They had loading on it. It didn't collapse. It only sagged, warped over time. There's no local failure. There's no transmission of local failures throughout the building. There's no global failure. There's no progressive collapse failure. So this is experimentation, which NIST did not obviously rely on or even report about the Cardington tests in the UK.
The specific structure of Building 7 that was first, I think, the first structure around the substation was first built to be able to resist the weight of 20 stories, and then there was added additional structures to it to resist. Wouldn't that specific structure with the fire be accountable for the failure of the building?
Building 7 was unusual in that it had these massive trusses that were spanning across an existing electrical substation. It had been hypothesized, and then the rest of the structure is built on top of and around that structure. So it was very unusual. So could the fire have weakened that structure and that been responsible for the part of the free fall collapse? No. These columns are absolutely massive. They're almost solid steel supporting those massive trusses. First of all, NIST, the official story, tells us that this initiation happened up on the 12th floor, which is well above those trusses. But even if there were massive fires on the lobby where there is no fuel, where those trusses are, let me withdraw that. Even if there was massive fires around those trusses, they could not, and those trusses are also fireproof, minimum 2 or 3 hours. The thicker and more massive a steel column is, the less it is vulnerable to heat, which is why the official story targets these lightweight floor trusses in the case of the Twin Towers. But even if it were true that this fire could have compromised the steel structure under these trusses, maybe one of those supports succumbs to a 1,200 degree Fahrenheit fire, what would happen? It would fail. We'd see, again, large gradual deformations reflected throughout the building, and the building would fall over. You'd have to take every one of those support trusses out at the same time. Precision. It's a fine art, the art of controlled demolition. Can fire accomplish that level of precision? Architects and engineers and everybody else who's thinking say no.
What is your hypothesis? What is your explanation for that?
So the only rational conclusion anybody can reach, and that the 1,460 architects and engineers for 911Truth have reached, is that the evidence, once you look at it and line it up, it all points to explosive controlled demolition with in this case, thermite or thermate, in the case of building 7. In the case of building 7.
And would that apply also to building 1 and 2? To tower 1 and 2?
Towers 1 and 2 are a whole different animal. They don't implode. They're a very explosive event. You want me to go into detail on this?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So it's not the same explosive that you use.